What's up, guys? Matthew here. Today, we are going to look at the biggest idiots on Everest history. From a 44-year-old woman who sat down beneath a collapsing ice tower because she needed 5 minutes, to a Karen who stayed in the summit queue as her tank ran dry, only to meet her limit in the most brutal way imaginable. It was April 18th, 2013. The spring climbing season on Mount Everest was just beginning. The Khumbu icefall had been equipped with fixed ropes and aluminum ladders. For climbers, the icefall represented the first major hazard, where avalanches, collapsing ice towers, and hidden crevasses could kill without warning. Bethany Prescott was 44 from Greenwich, Connecticut. She belonged to an exclusive country club where competition was constant. The previous year, a woman from her social circle had climbed Everest and given a presentation at the club. Bethany decided she would climb Everest as well, hiring a less expensive expedition company. She'd done minimal physical training, reasoning that she attended Pilates 3 times per week. She told friends she wanted to give her own presentation at the club the following year. During the trek to base camp, Bethany complained constantly. At base camp, her lack of preparation became obvious. Altitude affected her more severely than other clients. She spent 3 days with a severe headache and nausea. The expedition doctor recommended an extra acclimatization day. Bethany refused, stating she was on a schedule. The first acclimatization rotation was scheduled for April 18th. Climb through the Khumbu icefall to Camp 1 at 19,500 feet. Spend 1 night, then descend. The Khumbu icefall is a river of ice, moving several feet per day. This movement causes ice to fracture constantly, creating ice blocks the size of houses, deep crevasses, and unstable towers called seracs that can collapse without warning. Climbers cross using fixed ropes and ladders, typically starting around 2 or 3 a.m. when ice is most stable. As the sun warms the icefall becomes progressively more dangerous. By mid-morning, collapse risk increases dramatically. Experienced climbers aim to be through by 8 or 9 a.m. The expedition leader briefed the team the evening before. They would wake at 1:30 a.m. and begin climbing at 2:30 a.m. Bethany objected immediately, stating 1:30 a.m. was unreasonable. The leader explained this was standard protocol and non-negotiable. After 20 minutes, Bethany reluctantly agreed. At 1:30 a.m. on April 18th, the team began waking. Bethany had not gotten up. At 2 a.m., the leader found her still in her sleeping bag. The leader explained the group stayed together for safety. Bethany argued she would climb on her own schedule. The leader compromised. Bethany could depart at 4 a.m. with an assistant guide. The main group departed at 2:30 a.m. and reached Camp 1 by 7 a.m. Bethany and her assistant departed at 4 a.m. The crossing was slow. By 7 a.m., they were roughly halfway. The sun was up and temperature was rising. The assistant became increasingly concerned. They were entering the dangerous period. He urged Bethany to move faster. By 8:30 a.m., they were approximately 2/3 through. Temperature had risen above freezing. The icefall was audibly active. Constant creaking and groaning. Small chunks were falling from seracs. At approximately 9 a.m., they were beneath a massive ice serac, a tower roughly 60 feet tall and 40 feet wide, leaning at an angle. The serac was marked with warning flags. Standard protocol was to move through quickly. The assistant told Bethany they needed to move through quickly without stopping. Bethany stated she needed to rest first. The guide explained firmly they could not rest here. Bethany sat down and said she needed 5 minutes. The guide told Bethany that if she didn't start moving in 60 seconds, he would descend without her. The guide started counting down. At 30 seconds, Bethany stood up, angry, and started moving. They were approximately 50 feet past the serac, with perhaps another 100 feet before a clear, when the serac collapsed. There was no warning. Roughly 1,000 tons of ice fell and impacted the route. The assistant, ahead on the rope, heard the collapse and dove forward. He was hit by smaller chunks, knocked down and partially buried, but survived with injuries. Bethany was directly in the path of the main mass. She had no time to react. The ice hit her with tremendous force, killing her instantly. Her body was buried under several tons of ice blocks. The assistant freed himself and radioed for help. The rescue team reached the site within 90 minutes. The recovery operation took 2 full days. Bethany's body was located approximately 15 feet below the surface, crushed by the ice. Death had been instantaneous from massive trauma. The official investigation determined the serac collapse was a natural event that could not have been predicted with certainty. However, the investigation noted Bethany and her guide had been in the icefall during the dangerous late morning period when ice is most unstable, and that Bethany had delayed in a high-risk area despite warnings. It was May 23, 2018, above the balcony on Mount Everest at roughly 27,500 feet. The route was quiet in the early hours, the wind steady and dry, the sky clear enough to suggest safety. Climbers moved deliberately along the fixed line, aware that small inefficiencies at this height compound quickly. Nothing looked wrong. The failure was already underway. Daniel Moore was 45, an IT contractor from Manchester who spent most of the year traveling between short-term projects. He was disciplined, methodical, and physically fit, a runner who tracked metrics obsessively at sea level. On the mountain, he trusted routine and self-control. His expedition was self-funded, with no sponsors, and he took pride in not needing special treatment or extra support. Daniel prepared thoroughly in some areas and neglected others. He trained in cardiovascular endurance extensively, but underestimated cold weather hydration. He carried melted snow in a thin plastic bottle, tucked into his pack, uninsulated and exposed. At altitude, fluid intake is critical to maintain blood volume and oxygen delivery. Frozen water removes that margin quietly, without pain or immediate warning. During the ascent toward the balcony, wind chill dropped temperatures well below zero. The bottle froze solid within hours. Daniel stopped drinking long before the summit push, assuming he could push through mild thirst. Dehydration thickened his blood, worsening hypoxia and slowing his brain. His pace fell slightly. His movements grew less precise. No alarm sounded. Above the balcony, the slope steepened and the air thinned further. Daniel's breathing felt labored, each step heavier than the last. His oxygen mask felt restrictive. Judgment dulled by hypoxia and dehydration led him to misinterpret the sensation. He believed he was not getting air. He reached up and removed the mask. Without supplemental oxygen, his saturation dropped rapidly. He staggered, missing a step beside the fixed line, and fell forward into drifted snow. His face struck first. He did not attempt to arrest himself. The collapse was sudden and complete. Daniel lay prone, unconscious within seconds. Snow packed around his mouth and nose as wind drifted loose powder over his face. With no mask and no movement, his airway became obstructed. There was no visible struggle. Climbers behind him noticed him, only after he failed to move. A climber called out and radioed for help immediately. Others reached him within minutes, but could not safely reposition him without risking themselves. At that altitude, intervention options were limited. Oxygen was reapplied, but there was no response. He remained motionless as the wind continued to blow snow across his face. Rescue personnel were notified, but response time at that location exceeded an hour. By the time a team could safely approach, Daniel had been unresponsive for too long. He was pronounced dead on the route, secured to prevent further movement. The post-mortem examination later identified hypoxic collapse followed by asphyxiation due to airway obstruction. Snow and ice were found compacted in the nasal passages and mouth. Facial abrasions were consistent with a forward fall. There was no evidence of defensive movement after the collapse. No equipment malfunction was identified. His oxygen system was functional, and his mask showed no defects. The smartwatch recovered from his wrist recorded steady movement, followed by an abrupt stop. After the expedition, Daniel's family shared his smartwatch data with investigators. The hydration log showed fluid intake ceasing hours before the incident. The graph circulated quietly on UK climbing forums, posted without commentary. The danger wasn't dramatic. It was an empty thermos. It was May 19th, 2016. The south col of Mount Everest sits at 26,000 feet, and if you've never heard of it, it's basically the last camp before the summit. A flat, wind-blasted plateau where the air has about a third of the oxygen you'd breathe at sea level. That morning the sky was clear, temperatures around minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chill dragging it even lower. The summit was visible from camp, and I know that sounds like a good sign. It really wasn't. So here's who Derek Savelle was. 31 years old, wellness creator, the kind of person who built an audience by doing hard things and filming them. Cold plunges, extended fasts, high-altitude hikes. The whole brand was built around the idea that discomfort is a choice, and most people just aren't willing to push through it. Everest was supposed to be the proof, the ultimate episode. She had summited two 6,000-meter peaks before this, which sounds like solid experience. Until you realize the death zone on Everest starts right around where those mountains top out. She joined a commercial expedition as a paying client, showed up with her gear, her camera, and a summit speech she had written and rehearsed for weeks. A scripted speech. Who does that and genuinely thinks it's going to go fine? Now, before we get into what happened, you need to understand something about the death zone. Above 26,000 feet, your body is not maintaining, it is declining. Every minute you spend up there, especially standing still, your core temperature drops, your oxygen saturation drops, your ability to think clearly drops. It's not dramatic, it's just math. And because of that math, guided expeditions set a hard turnaround time, usually between 1 and 2 p.m. No exceptions, no negotiations, regardless of whether you've hit the summit or not. The mountain doesn't care how close you are. Miss that window and you are not getting down safely. That's just how it works. Darixa was already behind schedule before she even got to the hard part. Her Sherpa clocked it at the balcony, 27,600 feet, where she was running about 40 minutes slower than she needed to be. She reached the south summit sometime around midday, just barely inside the window, and right there her Sherpa gave her the options. Push straight to the true summit or turn around. What she could not do, what the situation physically would not allow, was stop and film. So she stopped and filmed. First take, wind noise. Second take, her buff was sitting wrong across her face. She fixed it, reviewed the footage on her camera screen, reset, went again. Her Sherpa warned her. She kept going. Warned her a second time. She kept going. By take 11, she was finally happy with it. Which makes me wonder, what exactly is going through your head on take 9? Take 10? At 28,700 feet, what are you telling yourself? She reached the true summit well past the cutoff. The time-stamped footage later confirmed she had burned through nearly an hour and a half at the south summit alone. The descent started immediately, but her body had already been losing the battle the entire time she was standing still in the cold running takes. By the Hillary step, she was stumbling on the fixed ropes. Her Sherpa was getting single-word answers to questions. Not a good sign at any altitude. Genuinely terrifying at this one. Not long after, she sat down on the ridge just below the step. Her Sherpa tried to get her back up, tried to physically support her and move her, but one person cannot carry a non-ambulatory adult at 28,000 feet. It's just not physically possible up there. She lost consciousness roughly 30 minutes after sitting down. No fall, no sudden event. She sat down, and that was it. I think if she had turned around at take 3, even take 5, we're probably not talking about her right now. The Sherpa radioed base camp shortly after she became unresponsive. A second Sherpa was sent up from Camp 4 but didn't reach her before dark. Helicopter rescue above 26,000 feet isn't viable. There's nothing anyone could do from the outside. Every option had already closed. The recovery team reached her the next morning and found her exactly where she had stopped. Still seated, still leaning against the ridge. The mountain had just held her there overnight. Recovery wasn't attempted given the location and conditions. Her camera was pulled from her jacket on site. Memory card intact. All 11 takes of the summit speech were on it, along with time-stamped footage that confirmed exactly how long she had been standing still at the south summit. That timestamp laid out the entire sequence without a single word needing to be said. Her death was ruled hypothermia, secondary to prolonged exposure above 28,000 feet. Delayed descent and physical exhaustion were listed as contributing factors. The expedition's incident report noted the turnaround advisory had been given twice and declined both times. The case was closed. Darixa came to Everest to get the perfect take. 11 tries in, she got it. She just never got to use it. It was September 15th, 2015, at Maiden Rock Quarry in Wisconsin. The late afternoon was overcast and windy, with visitors moving carefully along the quarry edge as others adjusted cameras and equipment for jumps. Derek Alden and his creative partner, Lila Donovan, had built their YouTube channel to 8,000 subscribers through increasingly dangerous stunts funded by energy drink sponsorships and athletic wear partnerships. Jake, 23, had dropped out of marketing school to pursue full-time content creation, while Lila, 25, left her job as a physical therapist to join him. Their revenue depended entirely on maintaining viewer engagement through escalating risks, with sponsors like Red Zone Energy and Apex Gear providing monthly payments contingent on hit targets and brand integration requirements. The quarry presented unique technical challenges that most amateur jumpers underestimated. The limestone walls contained irregular ledges and protruding rocks that created unpredictable wind currents, while the landing zone measured only 30 feet across. surrounded by submerged boulders and metal debris from the quarry's operational period. Professional cliff divers required extensive training to account for rotation, entry angle, and the precise timing needed to avoid serious injury. Derek and Lila had completed solo jumps from this location twice before, but their sponsor had specifically requested synchronized footage for an upcoming energy drink campaign launching in October. The planned stunt involved both creators jumping simultaneously from adjacent positions, spreading their arms mid-fall to create a dramatic thumbnail image before entering synchronized dives. Weather conditions had deteriorated throughout the afternoon, with gusting winds reaching 25 miles per hour and storm cells approaching from the west. Video and text records indicate both were aware of the approaching storm and both proceeded with the planned jumps. Two friends, Gideon Marsh and Ivy Prescott, positioned themselves with cameras at multiple angles to capture both the wide shot and close-up perspectives required for editing. The countdown began at 4:47 p.m. as both creators positioned themselves 12 feet apart along the quarry's edge. Jake's jump timing lagged approximately half a second behind Lila's, causing him to encounter the wind gust that caught her mid-fall and pushed her lateral trajectory 2 feet to the right. Lila's head contacted a limestone ledge, and Jake's body struck the rock face before entering the water. Gideon reported hearing an impact when Lila's head struck the rock. Jake's body hit the rock face twice during his descent, his left leg bending at an impossible angle against a ledge before he tumbled into the water, unconscious. Lila's head struck the limestone ledge, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. Derek entered the water unconscious and was later pronounced dead. Gideon called 911 at 4:48 p.m., but emergency responders required 43 minutes to reach the remote location and retrieve both bodies. The coroner determined Lila died from massive skull fracture and brain trauma, while Derek died from drowning complicated by multiple bone fractures and internal bleeding. Both deaths were ruled accidental with contributing factors of environmental conditions and inadequate safety planning. Investigators recovered helmet and ground cameras, which documented the sequence of the jumps and confirmed timing of the impacts. They noted that sponsorship and platform involvement did not contribute to the incident. The focus remained on the accident mechanics and safety factors. It was April 23, 2014. Ice climbing routes along a popular frozen waterfall corridor in Colorado had been closed for the season due to rapidly deteriorating ice conditions. Spring temperatures had been unseasonably warm for 2 weeks, with daytime highs in the mid-50s, causing significant melting and structural weakening of the ice formations. Nola Presswick was 29, a graphic designer from Portland with 2 seasons of ice climbing experience, including a dozen successful ascents of moderate WI3 and WI4 routes in the Cascades and Rockies. She was visiting Colorado for a long weekend and was disappointed to find her target routes closed. Despite the closure, she decided the warnings were overly cautious and planned to climb a route called Bridal Veil, a WI4 grade waterfall approximately 120 feet tall that formed over a rocky creek bed. Late-season ice becomes structurally unsound as spring temperatures rise. Repeated freeze-thaw cycles create internal weaknesses, causing the ice to become rotten, honeycombed with air pockets and prone to sudden, catastrophic failure. Visual inspection from below is often insufficient to detect rottenness, as the surface can appear solid while the interior has deteriorated. Ice screws may pull out under minimal force, and entire columns can detach from the rock with no warning. Water flowing beneath ice formations accelerates melting from below, further compromising stability. Nola arrived at the closure signs around 6 a.m. when the temperature was a relatively cool 38 degrees Fahrenheit. She hiked the approach trail and reached the base of Bridal Veil around 6:45 a.m. The waterfall looked intact from below, with a blue-white surface that appeared solid in the early morning light. She could hear water rushing beneath the ice, but attributed this to normal spring runoff. She geared up and began climbing around 7 a.m. The first 40 feet went smoothly. The ice accepted her tool placements with satisfying thunks, and her crampons bit securely. She placed 2 ice screws as protection, both of which seemed solid. Her confidence grew. Around 50 feet up, Nola noticed the ice quality changing. Her tools were penetrating more easily, almost too easily, and creating larger fractures around the impact points. She paused and tapped the ice with her tool. It sounded hollow in places, with a distinct difference from the solid tone she was accustomed to. She considered descending, but continued, reasoning she was already halfway up. At approximately 65 feet, Nola swung her right tool into the ice for her next placement. The tool punched through the surface entirely, penetrating into a hollow cavity behind. Before she could react, a vertical crack shot downward from the impact point. A section of ice, roughly 4 feet wide and 10 feet tall, detached from the underlying rock face. Nola's tools ripped free. The ice column, with her standing on it, tilted outward and fell away from the wall. She dropped backward through open air, still attached to the falling ice by her front points. The ice screws ripped out instantly. They had been anchored into the same rotten section. She fell approximately 65 feet, impacting the rushing creek below with tremendous force. The frigid water, moving fast with spring runoff, was roughly 4 feet deep where she landed. The impact stunned her, and her heavy pack immediately pulled her under. The current swept her downstream toward the deeper pool. She surfaced once, gasping, but couldn't gain purchase on the slick creek bed. The water was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, inducing immediate cold shock and rapidly impairing her muscle control. She went under again, tumbling over submerged rocks. Her crampons snagged on something underwater, pulling her face down. She inhaled reflexively, filling her lungs, and the current carried her into the deeper pool where she did not resurface. A solo hiker approaching on the trail heard the ice collapse and arrived at the base of the waterfall within minutes. He spotted Nola's body floating face down in the pool and immediately called for help. Responders arrived within 30 minutes, but she showed no signs of life when pulled from the water. Her camera, recovered from a waterproof pocket, showed photos taken at 6:52 a.m. from the base of the route. The ice screws she had placed were found still clipped to the rope, with the ice threading pulled cleanly through, evidence of the rotten ice's inability to hold under load. The collapsed ice section lay shattered at the base of the waterfall. Examination determined drowning as the cause of death, with cold water immersion as a significant contributing factor. Additional injuries included a dislocated shoulder, fractured collarbone, and severe bruising across her back and ribs from the impact, though none were individually fatal. Her core temperature at recovery was 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The investigation documented that she had bypassed closure signs and ignored posted warnings about unstable ice conditions. Her death was ruled accidental, noting that the closures existed specifically to prevent incidents like hers. It was May 8, 2016. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Advanced Base Camp on the north side sat at 21,300 feet, where climbers acclimatize before attempting higher camps during the narrow weather windows of climbing season. Valerie Hutchins was 38 years old, a housewife from Boston, Massachusetts. Her husband was a surgeon, and she had arranged childcare for their 2 children specifically for this expedition. Her climbing experience included guided trips to lower altitude peaks during favorable conditions, but she had never climbed above 20,000 feet. She had planned this Everest expedition for over a year as a personal challenge. She viewed weather forecasts with skepticism, believing they were often exaggerated to avoid liability. Everest's upper camps involved extreme altitude and exposure to severe weather. May marked the brief climbing season, but conditions remained unpredictable with sudden storms. Temperatures could drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. The route above Camp 2 crossed exposed terrain with limited shelter. Supplemental oxygen became increasingly important at higher elevations. Equipment failure or exposure at extreme altitude could be fatal within hours. The expedition leader had received weather reports predicting dangerous wind speeds and deteriorating conditions for the upper mountain. Forecasts showed a storm system moving in earlier than the planned weather window. The leader called a meeting the evening before to postpone the move to Camp 3 at 25,000 feet. Valerie argued for over 15 minutes about the decision. The leader explained that conditions exceeded safe parameters for the team. Valerie stated she had arranged her entire schedule around this expedition and had paid significant money. The leader offered to wait for better conditions in several days. Valerie refused, saying this was her only opportunity and that she had already been away from her children for weeks. The next morning before dawn, she left Camp 2 without her team. Other climbers noticed her heading up the route alone. She carried supplemental oxygen, but her pack appeared lighter than recommended. Another climber called out to her about the weather forecast. Valerie responded that forecasts were usually wrong and that she had proper gear. She insisted she knew her capabilities. The other climber returned to his tent. She climbed through the early morning, following the fixed ropes. The first several hours were manageable as she gained elevation. Higher up, wind speeds increased noticeably. She continued upward into more exposed terrain. Valerie reached higher on the route by mid-morning. Cloud cover had moved in, and light snow began falling. Wind speeds had increased significantly. She pulled her down suit tighter and continued climbing. Visibility dropped steadily as conditions worsened. She paused at a section of fixed rope to adjust her oxygen mask. Her fingers were becoming clumsy. Despite insulated gloves, she continued for another stretch, gaining more elevation. A particularly strong gust knocked her off balance. She stumbled and fell against rock. Her down suit tore on the exposed edge. Wind began penetrating the damaged section. She stood and tried to continue, but the wind had intensified to dangerous levels. Visibility had decreased to only a few feet. She could barely see the fixed ropes ahead. She attempted to descend, but her coordination was deteriorating. Her movements became increasingly erratic as altitude and cold took their toll. The conditions made it difficult to navigate, even with the fixed lines. She moved slowly, expending energy, and losing body heat through the damaged suit. She began shivering. Snow accumulated on her clothing and equipment. She found a small area behind a rock outcrop and crouched down. The wind still reached her at that elevation. Over the next hours, her shivering decreased. As her core temperature dropped, she became lethargic. Her oxygen supply was running low. She attempted to change the cylinder, but her coordination had failed. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. She slumped against the rocks. Her body was found 3 days later by a team moving between camps, located off the main route where she had sheltered. She was partially buried by snow that had accumulated during the storm. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as severe hypothermia, combined with altitude-related complications. The damaged down suit had accelerated heat loss at extreme altitude. She had been inadequately prepared for solo climbing in deteriorating conditions, lacking backup support and sufficient oxygen reserves. Her oxygen system showed she had depleted her supply. The death was determined to be accidental. It was April 28, 2016. Weather forecasts showed promising patterns for mid-May summit attempts on Mount Everest. Expedition teams were pushing through acclimatization rotations. Claudia Kensington was 48, a pharmaceutical sales director from Boston who managed a large team. She was known for demanding management and refusing excuses. She'd hired an expensive expedition company for premium service. From the beginning, she treated guides and staff as service employees rather than expert advisors. The trek to base camp showed Everest wouldn't respond to her usual approach. She struggled with altitude, arriving with a persistent headache and shortness of breath lasting 3 days. The expedition doctor recommended extra rest. Claudia refused, stating she had business obligations in 6 weeks. She brought a satellite phone and spent hours daily on conference calls from 17,600 feet. During the first acclimatization rotation, Claudia's oxygen saturation levels were consistently lower than others. At Camp 2, at 21,000 feet, her saturation was 65%, while others registered 70 to 75%. The guide recommended a slower schedule. She dismissed the concern, stating she'd completed the rotation and felt fine. The second rotation began April 28th. The plan was to climb to Camp 2, spend one night, continue to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet briefly, then descend. Claudia reached Camp 2 with oxygen saturation at 64%. She complained of headache and nausea. The doctor noted her breathing seemed labored, but lungs sounded clear. That evening, Claudia spent 2 hours on a conference call, her raised voice audible to others. She appeared agitated and had difficulty sleeping. The next morning, she reported poor sleep and headache, but insisted she was ready. The climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3 ascends the Lhotse face at 45 degrees or steeper, taking 4 to 6 hours. Claudia struggled from the beginning. Her pace was slow with frequent rest stops. She reached Camp 3 at 2 p.m. after 7 hours, exhausted and breathing heavily. Her oxygen saturation was 58%. The guide noticed her breathing seemed more labored than expected. Claudia admitted feeling extremely tired and short of breath. The guide decided to descend immediately. Claudia protested, saying she needed rest first. After discussion, she agreed. Descent began at 2:30 p.m. Within 15 minutes, Claudia was in serious trouble. Her coordination was poor and she moved extremely slowly. At approximately 23,000 feet, she began coughing. The cough was wet. Pink frothy sputum appeared on her glove. The guide recognized high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE. Fluid was accumulating in Claudia's lungs. HAPE requires immediate descent and can progress to death within hours. The guide radioed an emergency call. Over the next hour, Claudia's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her coughing became more frequent with pink, frothy fluid. Her breathing became increasingly labored, rapid, shallow breaths. Her lips and fingernails took on a bluish tint. Her oxygen saturation was 48%, critically low. The guide and two staff who'd climbed to assist essentially dragged Claudia down the Lhotse face. She could barely move. By 6 p.m., they'd only reached 22,000 feet. Claudia's consciousness was declining. She seemed confused and couldn't follow instructions. At approximately 21,500 feet, Claudia collapsed onto her hands and knees, coughing violently, bringing up large amounts of fluid. Then she slumped onto her side. The guide checked her breathing, rapid and gurgling. Her oxygen saturation was unmeasurable. He administered supplemental oxygen at maximum, 4 liters per minute. Her saturation came up to 52%, but she remained semi-conscious and unable to move. The guide radioed for helicopter evacuation, but helicopters couldn't operate at 21,500 feet as darkness fell. The team continued dragging Claudia. By 7:30 p.m., they reached Camp 2 at 21,000 feet. A helicopter attempted to reach them, but couldn't land safely. The pilot radioed he would try at first light. Claudia was placed in a tent with continuous oxygen. The doctor monitored her through the night. Her condition remained critical, semi-conscious, breathing rapidly, coughing up fluid. Her saturation remained in the low 50s despite maximum oxygen. At approximately 3 a.m. on April 30th, Claudia's breathing became more irregular. Several rapid breaths, then stopping for 10 to 15 seconds, then gasping. This pattern indicated her brain was being affected by severe oxygen deprivation. At 3:47 a.m., she stopped breathing entirely. The doctor attempted CPR, but knew it was futile at 21,000 feet. After 15 minutes, he stopped. Claudia Kensington was dead. The helicopter evacuation proceeded at dawn as body recovery. Claudia's body was flown to lower altitude, then returned to Boston. The official cause of death was high-altitude pulmonary edema, with contributing factors of inadequate acclimatization, continued ascent despite symptoms, and delayed descent. It was May 17, 2013, near the south summit of Mount Everest. A narrow ridge carried a fragile cornice outward into space, shaped by days of wind and new snow. Climbers moved cautiously, aware that the ridge held weight only when treated gently. The danger was not hidden. It waited for attention to drift. Ethan Brooks was 36, a freelance videographer who made his living selling dramatic outdoor footage. He chased moments that felt earned, believing proximity created truth. Sponsors were informal, small production houses and expedition operators who promised exposure rather than protection. He was skilled with cameras and calm under pressure, but framing often replaced caution. Oleg Kuznetsov was 44, a Russian climber on his final push. He moved slowly, clearly exhausted, his steps heavy and uneven. At this altitude, the ridge demands constant balance. Cornices form when wind deposits snow beyond solid ground, creating an unsupported shelf that can break without warning. Traffic was compressed near the south summit. Ethan stopped to film Oleg struggling, speaking softly as the camera rolled. He wanted the contrast between effort and exposure. Oleg paused, breathing hard, leaning on his axe. Guides ahead had warned about soft edges, but the moment felt controlled. Ethan backed up for a wider angle, eyes fixed on the viewfinder. His heel pressed into the cornice. The snow fractured cleanly. There was no sag, only a sudden release. The overhang collapsed, taking both men with it. They dropped together, bodies briefly suspended before the slope pulled them down. The falling mass triggered a small slab that carried them faster, tumbling and striking rock beneath the snow. Within seconds, they disappeared from view. Climbers above shouted and radioed for help. A call went out immediately. No one could descend safely onto the broken slope. Wind filled the air with drifting snow. Rescue teams reached the area hours later, but the slide path was silent. Recovering weeks later, both men had extensive blunt force injuries. Bones were broken throughout, and internal organs were destroyed. Death occurred during the fall, not afterward. The camera was recovered intact. Its final file contained shaking footage and wind noise, ending abruptly. The incident was logged as a fatal cornice collapse. No equipment failure was identified. The footage was archived by the expedition company. It was never released. Investigators noted the cornice line extended beyond the rock's spine, unsupported by ice. Weather records showed recent loading from crosswinds. The sequence matched eyewitness accounts and terrain evidence. No violations were cited, as filming had not breached any explicit rule. After the season, expedition briefings changed. Camera use was restricted on exposed ridges. Ethan's final project credit was removed. Oleg's name was added to the year's memorial list. The mountain kept its schedule, and teams returned when the window reopened. Lessons were shared quietly, without clips or commentary. Family notifications followed standard protocol. Effects were cataloged and returned later. Insurance claims closed the case administratively. No further action was recommended. Guides reiterated spacing, awareness, and cornice avoidance in subsequent briefings. The ridge remained exposed to the same forces. Conditions are repeated yearly. Attention determined outcomes. The loss entered statistics, not headlines. A reminder carried in training notes and margins. Records listed time, location, and cause. Names were logged and dates filed. No anomalies remained. Operations resumed per plan, and traffic normalized. Silence returned to the ridge, shaped again by wind and snow, alone. It was May 23, 2017. The upper mountain was clear, one of those rare summit windows that pulls every waiting team out of their tents at once. The south col was crowded. Fixed ropes above the balcony were moving slowly under the weight of traffic, and temperatures at the summit that morning were sitting around minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be in a line of people all quietly racing the same clock, that's the south col on a good weather day. Everyone up there knows the window. Everyone up there is counting. Kelso Prin had a different kind of count going. 34 years old, content creator, built his whole thing around firsts. First to broadcast live from extreme locations. First to put his audience inside moments nobody had streamed before. Everest was his largest production yet, and he had secured paid access from his audience to watch a live summit broadcast, his primary revenue event for the year. He had reached high altitude before on Aconcagua without serious incident, and I think that probably gave him more confidence than the situation actually warranted. He arrived with a custom-rigged satellite broadcast pack that shared a battery system with his heated glove liners, a setup his own technician had flagged as a power management risk before departure. Kelso noted it and moved on. Someone had already seen it coming, so what was he thinking? Here's the thing about summit day on Everest. You're basically running a race where the finish line is also the halfway point. You push through the night, hit the top, and then you still have to get all the way back down before the mountain decides it's done cooperating. Every team on that col knew the drill. Kelso knew it too. He just had a live audience to keep happy on top of all that, and that's where things started getting complicated. The live stream kicked off at Camp 4 and ran straight through the ascent. The battery pack was drawing more power than anticipated. Lithium batteries lose significant efficiency below freezing, something that hadn't been properly accounted for at that altitude. The drain was happening the entire time, quietly, steadily, with every hour of broadcast. By the time Kelso reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, his heated glove liners had dropped to minimal function. He noticed his fingertips were numb. He kept moving. He didn't switch off the broadcast. People had paid for it, and he wasn't about to cut the feed with the summit still above him. I get the logic, but the mountain was already collecting on that decision, and he had no idea. He reached the summit and broadcast from the top for close to 20 minutes. By any measure, that's the moment the whole expedition was built around. What nobody watching could see was that his hands were already in serious trouble. The glove system had been effectively dead for hours. He turned around and started down, and that's when the full weight of it started to show. The descent required heavy Sherpa assistance because Kelso could not grip the fixed ropes properly. Not struggling, could not grip. He reached Camp 4 by early afternoon, and the expedition medic at base camp pushed hard for an immediate helicopter evacuation. Both hands were waxy, pale, hardening across all fingers. Kelso refused. He had announced a post-summit recovery series during the live stream, and he intended to film it from base camp. He wasn't going anywhere. And this, right here, is where the story stops being about equipment failure and turns into something else entirely. He spent 2 nights at Camp 4 before working his way down to base camp over the following days. 4 days after summiting, by the time he got there, both hands had visible tissue discoloration, skin beginning to blister. He was evacuated to a lower altitude medical facility, but not because he agreed to go. The expedition leader overrode his refusal and arranged transport. By the time he reached medical care, the infection had spread well beyond his hands. Surgical intervention was attempted. It wasn't enough. Kelso Prin died 9 days after standing on the summit of Everest. 9 days. He survived the climb, survived the descent, made it all the way back to base camp, and then died from something that was entirely preventable if he had just left when he was told to. The findings confirmed septic shock as cause of death, secondary to bilateral deep frostbite with critically delayed treatment. The report was blunt about it. Evacuation within 24 hours of descent would have significantly changed the outcome. I think about that a lot. 24 hours was all the margin there was between a bad outcome and a survivable one. Battery drain logs from the broadcast rig confirmed the power crossover failure. The glove system had been running well below effective output long before he reached the summit. The live stream footage was reviewed and the timeline reconstructed from it. The expedition's formal report noted that evacuation had been recommended and refused on 2 separate occasions before the leader stepped in. The case was closed as accidental death, delayed treatment listed as the determining factor. It was October 12, 2016, on the northeast ridge of Mount Everest at 26,400 feet. The early morning was cold and still, with climbers checking equipment and adjusting breathing apparatus, while others moved carefully across the ice and rock. Marcus Fenwick, 31, had been documenting extreme stunts online for a small audience of a few thousand followers. He specialized in staged emergency scenarios, including simulated injuries and survival challenges in high-altitude environments. His focus was on creating content that appeared dangerous while remaining under controlled conditions. Death zone mountaineering presented unique physiological challenges that made survival dependent on rapid ascent and descent protocols. Above 26,000 feet, atmospheric pressure drops to approximately 1/3 of sea level conditions, forcing climbers to use supplemental oxygen systems while their bodies gradually shut down from cellular damage caused by extreme hypoxia. Medical briefings provided to Everest expeditions consistently warn that decision-making capacity degrades rapidly at this elevation, often without the climber recognizing the decline. Helicopter operations at this altitude approach the absolute limits of aircraft performance, requiring perfect weather conditions and exceptional pilot skill. Flight windows are often measured in minutes, with wind speed, visibility, and air density determining whether lift is even possible. Marcus had hired a specialized high-altitude helicopter crew for $75,000 to capture footage of his planned fake emergency, scheduling the filming during a period of favorable weather conditions. The staged rescue scenario involved Marcus simulating a severe ankle injury that would require helicopter evacuation, with Derek documenting his apparent distress while maintaining radio contact with the aircraft crew positioned at base camp. Weather conditions began deteriorating rapidly after their arrival, with wind speeds increasing to 40 miles per hour and visibility dropping due to approaching snow squalls. The helicopter pilot advised postponing the filming due to unsafe flying conditions, but Marcus insisted on proceeding after calculating that delaying would cost him the optimal upload slot before competing channels released similar content. Marcus began his performance at 11:30 a.m., removing his outer insulation layers and oxygen mask to appear more vulnerable while Derek filmed from multiple angles. The exposure was intentional, meant to heighten visual realism for viewers unfamiliar with altitude risk. The planned scenario called for 30 minutes of footage showing escalating hypothermia symptoms before the dramatic helicopter rescue sequence. Within 15 minutes, Marcus's core body temperature began dropping rapidly as the combination of high altitude, extreme cold, and removed protective equipment created genuine hypothermia conditions. His shivering intensified, but Derek continued filming, unaware that the situation had become life-threatening. Audio captured labored breathing and intermittent coughing as oxygen deprivation compounded the heat loss. By the 40-minute mark, Marcus had progressed into moderate hypothermia with confusion, slurred speech, and uncontrolled muscle contractions. His skin turned blue-gray, while his breathing became increasingly shallow, but Derek remained focused on capturing dramatic footage, rather than recognizing medical emergency symptoms. Later analysis noted that these signs matched textbook indicators of advanced cold stress rather than simulated performance. The helicopter crew, monitoring weather conditions from base camp, determined that flying had become impossible due to deteriorating visibility and dangerous wind shear at altitude. Marcus lost consciousness at 12:47 p.m., while Derek finally realized the situation had become genuinely life-threatening and activated emergency protocols. Ground-based rescue teams required 8 hours to reach their location, finding Marcus deceased from severe hypothermia and exposure. Jake's footage documented the entire progression from staged performance to actual medical emergency. The coroner determined death resulted from hypothermia and hypoxic brain injury caused by prolonged exposure to extreme altitude without adequate protection or supplemental oxygen. Marcus's channel was permanently suspended following investigation by authorities and YouTube's policy enforcement team. The platform cited violations related to dangerous activities and misrepresentation of risk. The helicopter crew faced no legal consequences as weather conditions had made rescue operations objectively impossible. Derek Sullivan required psychiatric treatment for trauma related to witnessing and inadvertently documenting his friend's death. It was June 22, 2016. The limestone cliffs above Red River Gorge in Kentucky had been temporarily restricted due to ongoing rockfall from unstable formations near the upper rim. Saoirse Delmar was 27, a veterinary assistant from Lexington with 4 years of climbing experience, including 2 seasons of regular outdoor climbing at various crags in Kentucky and Tennessee. She'd completed dozens of routes in the 5.8 to 5.10 range with ropes and had led a handful of single-pitch climbs. She considered herself more skilled than she actually was and frequently dismissed safety protocols as overcautious. Saoirse had free soloed twice before, both easy 5.6 routes, and believed she could handle harder grades. She thought the restriction was temporary bureaucracy and that the rock was stable enough for experienced climbers. Her goal was to solo a route called Broken Arrow, a 5.8 climb she'd completed twice before with a rope and belayer. Limestone is notorious for unpredictable fractures, especially after water infiltration weakens the stone's internal structure. Handholds and footholds that seem solid can snap off under body weight. A fall from 150 feet onto talus is almost universally fatal. Impact forces far exceed what the human body can withstand, causing catastrophic internal injuries, skull fractures, and spinal damage. At free fall velocity, from that height, the body reaches approximately 65 miles per hour before impact. Saoirse arrived at the gorge around 8 a.m. and immediately noticed the fencing and printed warnings detailing recent rockfall incidents and visible cracks in the upper cliff sections. She walked the perimeter until finding a gap in the barrier near a creek bed, slipping through and hiking the half-mile approach to Broken Arrow's base. Chalk marks from previous climbers were still visible on the lower holds, which reassured her the route was still being climbed. She spent 20 minutes stretching and examining the first 40 feet of the climb, which looked identical to her previous rope descents. What she didn't inspect was the upper section, specifically a hairline crack running vertically through a key ledge at around 150 feet. Saoirse began climbing at 9:15 a.m., moving smoothly through the lower crux sections, her confidence built with each successful move. By 9:40 a.m., Saoirse had reached the ledge, where the route transitioned onto a broad shelf before continuing up a steeper headwall. She stepped onto it with her right foot, transferring her full body weight. The ledge, undermined by the fracture, held for roughly 2 seconds before detaching from the wall. A section of limestone weighing several hundred pounds broke free, tilting outward. Saoirse's foot slipped as the rock gave way, and she lost her grip on the handholds above. She fell backward, arms flailing instinctively for anything to grab. There was nothing. Her body dropped in free fall, tumbling slightly as she accelerated. She impacted the talus 3 seconds later, landing on her back and left side. The sound echoed through the gorge. Her skull fractured on impact. Multiple ribs broke and punctured both lungs, and her spine fractured in 3 places. Death was likely instantaneous, though her heart continued beating weakly for several minutes as blood pooled in her chest cavity. 2 hikers on a nearby trail heard the impact and immediately called for help. Responders reached Saoirse's location within 35 minutes, but she had no pulse and showed no signs of respiration. The detached ledge section was found shattered near her body. The medical examiner's report listed massive blunt force trauma as the primary cause of death. with fatal injuries including basilar skull fracture, bilateral hemothorax from rib penetration, and spinal transection at T7. The broken ledge showed clear evidence of a stress fracture along a vertical plane, formed when heavy spring rainfall saturated the porous limestone and compromised its structural integrity. Photographs documented Sayers' chalk marks ascending the face to the precise point where the ledge separated. Investigators recovered her car keys and phone from a small pack at the cliff base, confirming she had climbed entirely alone without informing anyone of her plans or location. The restriction remained active for another 8 months, while additional unstable sections were identified and removed. Her death was classified as accidental, occurring in a clearly marked restricted area that she had deliberately entered by bypassing safety barriers. The fracture that caused the ledge failure had not been visible from below and could only have been detected through close inspection or specialized equipment. It was May 11, 2017. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. At Camp 2 in the western CWM, climbers rested in their tents at 21,000 feet, preparing for rotations to higher camps. Shelby Fairchild was 51 years old, a grandmother and part-time yoga instructor from Greenwich, Connecticut. She had recently become a grandmother and wanted to prove she was still capable of major physical achievements. She had paid significant money for a guided Everest expedition using inheritance funds. Her climbing experience included guided trips to Kilimanjaro and a failed attempt on Aconcagua, where she had turned back due to altitude sickness. She was fit for her age but had never spent extended time above 20,000 feet. She viewed the expedition as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and was determined to be the grandmother who summited Everest. Everest's extreme altitude created severe physiological challenges. Above 21,000 feet, the body deteriorated rapidly. Oxygen levels were a fraction of sea level. Altitude sickness could progress from mild symptoms to life-threatening conditions within hours. High-altitude pulmonary edema involved fluid accumulation in the lungs, causing breathing difficulty and chest tightness. The only effective treatment was rapid descent to lower elevation. Supplemental oxygen provided temporary relief, but was not a substitute for descent. Climbers needed to carry their own equipment and maintain self-sufficiency even with guide support. The expedition had spent weeks acclimatizing through rotations between camps. Shelby had complained of headaches for multiple days, but insisted they were tension headaches from stress. The lead guide conducted daily health checks. At Camp 2, Shelby's oxygen saturation was measured below the normal range for that altitude. She had developed a persistent dry cough. The guide recommended descending to base camp for rest and monitoring. Shelby refused, stating she was on a schedule and needed to continue upward to Camp 3. She had been asking guides to carry portions of her gear since lower camps. The guides explained that each climber needed to manage their own equipment for safety and self-sufficiency. Shelby argued that she had paid for a premium service and expected accommodation. She stated that carrying equipment was what guides were for. The guides explained that at extreme altitude, each person needed to be self-sufficient. Shelby became irritated and mentioned the significant amount of money she had invested in the expedition. By evening, Shelby's cough had worsened, and she was breathing more rapidly than normal. She had difficulty sleeping, despite supplemental oxygen. The next morning, the guide strongly recommended she descend immediately to base camp. Shelby refused, saying she hadn't paid thousands of dollars to turn back. She insisted the symptoms were minor and would improve with rest. The guide explained that her symptoms indicated possible pulmonary edema, and that continuing upward could be fatal. Shelby became angry and accused them of trying to end the expedition early. She threatened to leave negative reviews and contact the company owner. After extensive discussion, the guides made the decision to begin descending with her, explaining they would not allow her to continue upward in this condition. The descent began mid-morning. Shelby moved slowly, stopping frequently. Her breathing was labored, and she was coughing more frequently. As they descended through the western CWM toward base camp, she was coughing up small amounts of pink, frothy fluid. The guides increased the pace of descent. Shelby's breathing became increasingly difficult. Her lips had a bluish tint. She stopped and sat down in the snow. The guides administered supplemental oxygen from the emergency supply. They helped her to her feet and supported her weight as they continued descending. Her cough produced more pink froth. As they continued lower, her breathing had become a wet, gurgling sound. She could no longer walk, even with support. The guides radioed ahead for assistance. Additional team members came up from base camp with a rescue sled. Her consciousness was fading. Her breathing became irregular and gasping. The guides placed her on the sled and began moving her downward as quickly as possible. She stopped breathing. They performed resuscitation efforts while continuing to descend toward base camp. She remained unresponsive. They confirmed death after extended efforts. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as high-altitude pulmonary edema. The lungs had filled with fluid, preventing oxygen from entering the bloodstream. Contributing factors included inadequate acclimatization response, refusal to descend despite early symptoms, and delayed descent when symptoms became severe. The examiner noted that pulmonary edema was reversible with prompt descent, and that her death could likely have been prevented if she had descended when first advised. The delay had allowed the condition to progress beyond recovery. It was April 22, 2015. The spring climbing season on Mount Everest was underway, with expedition teams making acclimatization rotations. At base camp at 17,600 feet, climbers were preparing for their second rotation. Tessa Hargrove was 39, a lifestyle blogger from Scottsdale, Arizona. Everest was her most ambitious project, a series she'd pre-sold to outdoor gear companies as sponsored content. She'd spent more money on camera equipment than proper cold weather gear. Her jacket was rated only to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, inadequate for Everest where temperatures drop below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. During the trek to base camp, Tessa complained constantly about accommodations, food, and pace. She treated porters dismissively, referring to them as the help. At tea houses, she insisted on private rooms and threatened bad reviews when told she'd have to share. During the first rotation, Tessa stopped frequently for photos, forcing others to wait. When teammates expressed frustration, she responded that her sponsors expected content and she was paying for the expedition. At Camp 1 at 19,500 feet, she spent 2 hours staging tent photos while teammates rested. On April 22nd, the team began their second rotation through the Khumbu icefall. The climb started at 3 a.m. when ice was most stable. Tessa moved slowly, stopping repeatedly. Other climbers had to navigate around her. When her guide urged her to maintain pace, she snapped that he was being unprofessional and she'd document his attitude for the expedition company. At one point, she removed her gloves for 5 minutes to operate her camera in minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, demanding her guide hold her ice axe. Her fingers turned white, then red. The guide told her to put gloves back on. Tessa accused him of overreacting. They reached Camp 1 and continued to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet the next day. At Camp 2, Tessa's oxygen saturation was 68%, acceptable. She complained of headache and fatigue, but dismissed these as minor. The plan was to rest briefly, then descend to Camp 1 before nightfall. At 2 p.m., as the team prepared to descend, Tessa announced she was staying longer to photograph the Lhasa face. Her guide explained they needed to descend before afternoon heat destabilized the route. Tessa responded that her sponsors expected specific shots, and she wasn't leaving until she got them. She'd paid for this expedition and would decide when to leave. After heated argument, the guide gave her a deadline. 2:30 p.m. Tessa spent 30 minutes taking photographs, changing jackets 3 times for different looks. She demanded other climbers move out of her frame. Each time she removed layers, her body lost heat. By departure, her fingers were numb. The guide examined her hands. Early frostbite. Tessa blamed him for not warning her properly. The descent was slow. Tessa's coordination was impaired. She stumbled repeatedly. By 4 p.m., they'd only descended halfway. At approximately 19,800 feet, Tessa sat down, saying she needed rest. The guide checked her oxygen saturation, 62%. Her speech was slurred. He urged her to continue. She stood but sat back down, reporting dizziness and nausea. The guide recognized acute mountain sickness and administered emergency oxygen. The oxygen helped initially, but Tessa couldn't walk. The guide and assistant began dragging her downward. Progress was agonizingly slow. At approximately 5:15 p.m., at 19,600 feet, Tessa suddenly pulled away and stumbled sideways off the route. She took 3 steps onto untracked snow. The snow collapsed beneath her. She'd stepped onto a snow bridge, covering a crevasse. The bridge gave way, and Tessa fell through. The guide rushed to the edge. The crevasse was 8 feet wide, narrowing as it descended. He could see Tessa approximately 40 feet down, wedged between ice walls, not moving. He called her name repeatedly. No response. He radioed an emergency call. A rescue team arrived 90 minutes later after dark. A rescuer descended and reached Tessa 40 feet below the surface. Wedged between ice walls, the rescuer checked for vital signs. None. Tessa was dead. Her oxygen mask had been torn off during the fall. Recovery took 3 hours. Tessa's body was brought to Camp 1, then carried to base camp the next day. The official cause of death was trauma from the fall, combined with hypoxia and hypothermia. Contributing factors included altitude sickness, inadequate cold weather gear leading to frostbite, and exhaustion from prioritizing photography over proper acclimatization. The guide's logs documented repeated warnings, her dismissive responses, and threats regarding his conduct. Her camera was recovered with her body, containing hundreds of photos from the days before her death. The expedition company added protocols requiring guides to confiscate cameras if clients prioritized photography over safety. Tessa Hargrove's body was returned to Arizona for burial. It was May 16, 2014, at the Hillary Step on Mount Everest, roughly 28,900 feet above sea level. Camp 4 departures had been delayed overnight, compressing climbers into a narrow summit window. Wind was moderate, visibility was clear, and the fixed lines were already crowded. The mountain was not hostile that morning. It was simply unforgiving of small mistakes. Miguel Arroyo was 39, a warehouse supervisor from Puebla, Mexico, accustomed to long shifts and physical work. He trained hard, trusted his strength, and believed endurance could bridge gaps in experience. His expedition was budget constrained, relying on rented equipment secured days before the climb. New high-altitude boots were fitted quickly, adequate on paper, unfamiliar in reality. Kenji Sato was 52, a Japanese hobby climber who approached Everest methodically. He kept detailed journals, followed checklists, and moved deliberately on fixed lines. Kenji had summited lower peaks over decades and accepted slow progress as safety. He was clipped directly behind Miguel that day, maintaining minimal spacing to keep the line moving. The Hillary Step had become a choke point as climbers queued to ascend and descend. Miguel felt the delay, cutting into his turnaround margin, and rushed final adjustments. He tightened one boot fully. The other was left marginal, snug enough to walk, but not locked for lateral loading. No one stopped him. Time pressure overruled rechecking. As the line inched forward, Miguel stepped high onto a rock edge, glazed with old ice. The move required sideways pressure. His loose boot twisted. The ankle snapped outward with a crack heard by climbers above and below. Miguel screamed and collapsed backward, slamming into the rope. Kenji was clipped close and was yanked forward instantly. Miguel flailed, loading the fixed line violently. The rope jerked. Kenji's carabiner rotated under shock, cross-loaded against the rock. The gate failed. Both men lost attachment simultaneously. They tumbled together down the south face, bodies striking rock steps in rapid succession. Helmets shattered. Packs tore free. Within seconds, they disappeared from view, falling hundreds of feet. Climbers above shouted and called on radios. No rescue was possible from that position. Later examination found Miguel suffered an open ankle fracture before the fall, followed by massive blunt force injuries incompatible with life. Kenji sustained immediate cervical spine transection on the first major impact. Rope fibers and carabiner deformation were consistent with extreme shock loading beyond design limits. The incident was logged as a fatal fall involving equipment misuse under congestion. The rental shop later revised boot-fitting policies and required extended testing before issuance. Kenji's journal was recovered from his pack, the final entry reading, "Check boots twice." Recovery was delayed by traffic and altitude, and both bodies were located days later below the route. Weather windows limited movement, and teams documented the scene before descent. The fixed line was replaced, and spacing rules were reiterated during subsequent summit pushes. The loss reinforced how congestion amplifies minor errors into shared consequences. Investigators noted no manufacturing defects in the rope or hardware. The sequence matched eyewitness accounts and standard failure modes. Climbers behind were instructed to descend immediately. Operations resumed later with stricter turnaround enforcement and mandatory gear checks at Camp 4. Guides briefed clients on spacing, communication, and rechecking boots at every stop. The summit window closed soon after. The mountain remained unchanged, but the margin for error was shown to be thinner than schedules allowed. Both families were notified through their expedition operators, and personal effects were returned during the following season after recovery efforts concluded under clear documentation and chain of custody procedures observed strictly. It was May 7, 2014. The Lhotse Face, a 4,000-foot wall of blue glacial ice rising from Camp 2 toward Camp 3, was in its standard early May condition. Hard, steep, and completely unforgiving. Fixed ropes ran the full length of it, anchored at intervals into the ice. Temperature on the face that morning was sitting around -15 degrees Fahrenheit with moderate wind. For most teams, it was a routine rotation day. For one climber, it was the last morning of his life. Kalen Riker was 33, and his whole channel was built on one thing: gear. Reviews, comparisons, recommendations. Brands paid him to feature their equipment because his audience actually trusted what he said. That trust was the entire business. For the Everest expedition, he had received a full kit sponsorship covering ascenders, carabiners, harness, and crampons, all rated and certified for high altitude use. Before departing, he returned the certified ascender and primary carabiner set to the sponsors, kept the reimbursement value, and sourced cheaper, non-certified replacements from an online supplier. Told nobody. He had climbed to 6,000 meters before and figured the swap was low risk. The gear looked identical, and that was the whole idea. I've covered a lot of cases where the decision that kills someone happens weeks before they ever get into trouble. This is one of those. So here's what an ascender actually does. It's a mechanical device that grips a fixed rope and lets you move upward on it. On a near vertical ice face, it's essentially what keeps you on the mountain. The cam mechanism inside has to work reliably in extreme cold, and that's exactly what certified gear is rated for. Cheaper non-certified versions are built to lower tolerances, weaker springs, inferior alloys, and in sub-zero temperatures, those tolerances can give out in ways you can't predict and can't recover from. On a 45-degree ice face, that kind of failure doesn't come with a warning. It just happens. During the first rotation to Camp 2, Kalen noticed his ascender felt a little stiff, but worked it manually and kept going. He even filmed a short kit review clip at Camp 2. The non-certified ascender right there in the footage, and he's naming the certified brand on camera without missing a beat. Didn't even hesitate. On the second rotation toward Camp 3 on May 7th, the overnight temperature drop had stiffened the cam mechanism even further. He was about 1,100 feet above Camp 2 on the Lhotse Face when he stopped to adjust his pack. Completely routine, the kind of stop you make without thinking about it. He unweighted his ascender to reposition it higher on the rope. Standard move. Every climber on that face does it constantly. The cam didn't re-engage. He put his full body weight onto it, assuming it had locked. It hadn't. The ascender slipped down the rope before he even registered what was happening, and by then his weight was already committed. He, Amai, grabbed the fixed rope with his right hand, but it was iced over and his glove couldn't get enough grip. He went backward off the face. The fall ran roughly 300 feet before the fixed rope system caught him, but the arrest was violent. He hit the ice face during the fall and came to a stop against the rope anchor. A climbing team below saw the whole thing and reached him within 15 minutes. He was alive but unresponsive, visible head trauma, suspected spinal injury. He died before any descent could be organized. The witness team radioed base camp straight away. A helicopter was dispatched, but the Lhotse Face doesn't allow for landing. It could only observe. Getting him off that face with the personnel on hand wasn't realistic. He was confirmed dead at the scene about 40 minutes after the fall. Here's the thing about this case that I find hard to shake. The fraud didn't come out on the mountain. It came out after. The ascender was recovered with the body and examined by the expedition's equipment team. Non-certified product, completely inconsistent with the brand Kalen had been claiming to use. Sponsor records confirmed the certified gear had been returned before he even left. The swap was deliberate, it was documented, and it was fatal. The camera footage from Camp 2 was recovered and reviewed. That kit review clip where he's holding the counterfeit gear and naming the certified brand is sitting right there in the incident record. Cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries consistent with a high-altitude fall. Equipment failure cited as the primary contributing factor. The gear discrepancy was formally documented and passed to the relevant authorities. No ambiguity, no loose ends. He had built an entire channel on the credibility of his gear recommendations, pocketed the budget that was supposed to keep him alive, and the mountain collected what was owed. It was November 14th, 2015. Mount Whitney's eastern approach had been officially closed for the season due to early snowpack and dangerous ice conditions above 12,000 feet. Posted barriers and caution tape blocked the trailhead, with printed notices warning of fines and serious alpine hazards. Theo Branick was 31, a software technician from Sacramento with moderate hiking experience but limited winter mountaineering skills. He was known among friends for impatience with rules he considered excessive. Theo had attempted Whitney twice before during illegal seasons, but turned back both times due to altitude sickness. This trip was a spontaneous weekend decision to finally summit before winter fully locked in. He'd bragged to co-workers that closures were just liability protection. Mount Whitney's eastern approach gains over 6,000 feet across miles of exposed alpine terrain, becoming barren and featureless under snow well before the summit. In mid-November, temperatures routinely drop well below freezing overnight, with a wind chill pushing conditions to life-threatening extremes within hours. The trail disappears entirely under heavy snowpack, and navigation without intimate familiarity with the terrain is exceptionally difficult, even with GPS. Theo bypassed the closure barriers around 4:30 p.m., just as the last daylight was fading. He'd ignored repeated online warnings about the trail conditions and early sunset. A ranger vehicle had been parked near the trailhead earlier that day, but Theo waited until it left to begin his ascent. The trail was snow-covered within the first mile, and his running shoes offered no traction on ice patches. By 6 p.m., full darkness had settled, and his headlamp beam barely penetrated the swirling snow. Theo continued upward, confident he could identify the route from summer photos he'd studied. At roughly 10,200 feet, after nearly 4 hours of slow climbing, he reached an area where snow had completely obscured the trail. Multiple drainage paths branched off in different directions. He chose what appeared to be the main path based on instinct. It was the wrong direction. By 9 p.m., Theo realized he'd been climbing into a side drainage instead of following the main trail. His GPS app showed he was nearly a mile off route, heading into unmapped terrain. He attempted to backtrack, but his footprints had been filled in by fresh snow. The temperature had dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind gusts reached 35 miles per hour. His light jacket, soaked from brushing against snow-laden branches, and from sweat, stopped providing insulation. He began shivering violently. Theo tried to call for help, but his phone showed no signal. Around 9:45 p.m., his headlamp began dimming noticeably. The combination of cheap batteries and extreme cold was draining them faster than normal. He tried replacing them with his spare set, but his fingers were already numb and clumsy. He dropped one battery in the snow and couldn't find it in the darkness. In the weakening light, he stumbled forward, hoping to find the main trail. Instead, he tripped over a concealed rock and twisted his ankle severely. The pain made walking nearly impossible. His headlamp died completely around 10:30 p.m. In total darkness, he crawled beneath a cluster of stunted pines and curled into a ball, trying to preserve warmth. His core temperature began dropping rapidly. Shivering stopped after an hour, a sign his body was shutting down. He lost consciousness around midnight. The snowfall continued through the night, covering his position completely. Theo's absence wasn't reported until Monday afternoon, when his roommate realized he hadn't returned from what was supposed to be a day hike. His car was found at the closed trailhead Tuesday morning. A search team deployed Tuesday afternoon, following standard grid patterns from the official trail. They found his body Thursday afternoon, roughly 700 feet below and northeast of where the main trail should have been, at that elevation, partially buried under 8 inches of new snow. The medical examiner determined Theo died from severe hypothermia, with contributing factors including exhaustion, dehydration, and a sprained ankle that immobilized him. His core body temperature had likely dropped below 85 degrees Fahrenheit within 2 hours of becoming stationary. Time of death was estimated between midnight and 2 a.m. on November the 15th. Evidence recovered included his phone with logged attempts to access GPS between 8:45 p.m. and 9:30 p.m., all showing him progressively farther from the maintained trail. His pack contained no emergency bivvy, inadequate spare batteries, and no insulated layers. The case was ruled accidental death due to exposure. Investigators noted that Theo had willfully bypassed multiple closure barriers and ignored clearly posted warnings about life-threatening conditions. It was April 23, 2018, at the Khumbu Icefall on Mount Everest. The early morning was cold and dark, with climbers moving carefully across ladders and ice while others checked equipment and ropes. Jade Monroe had built a profitable YouTube channel with approximately 9,000 subscribers by testing outdoor equipment in extreme conditions. The 29-year-old former software engineer from Seattle had leveraged his technical skills and willingness to risk personal safety into sponsorship deals with an outdoor equipment company and a climbing gear manufacturer. His revenue model depended on exclusive first-look reviews of prototype equipment, often receiving gear months before public release, in exchange for detailed technical analysis and real-world stress testing that manufacturers use to refine their products. Contracts reviewed by investigators in Ecuadorian later showed that delivery deadlines were tied to competitor release schedules rather than environmental conditions. The Khumbu Icefall presented unique technical challenges that made it an ideal testing ground for ice climbing equipment. The glacier moved approximately 3 feet daily, creating constantly shifting crevasses and unstable ice formations that required specialized gear, including crampons, ice axes, and harnesses rated for dynamic loading. Fixed lines, aluminum ladders, and anchors were repositioned daily by icefall doctors to account for overnight movement. Jade wore climbing boots from a small startup gear company, which had paid him for exclusive review rights to their carbon fiber crampon integration system. Designed to embed metal spikes directly into the boot sole, the design eliminated traditional strap or clip-on crampons in favor of a bonded structural interface intended to reduce weight and improve energy transfer. The planned route through the icefall typically required 6 hours to complete, but unseasonably warm temperatures had accelerated glacier movement and created new hazards overnight. Expedition leaders had issued warnings about increased rockfall and serac collapse, recommending that teams delay passage until conditions improved. Several commercial teams postponed their rotations that morning, choosing to remain at base camp despite favorable visibility. Jade ignored these advisories after pressure from the startup to complete his review before a competitor's launch. His filming assistant, guide Pemba Sherpa, expressed concerns but ultimately accompanied him after additional payment. Expedition logs later noted that the ascent occurred outside the recommended crossing window due to rising temperatures after sunrise. The ascent began smoothly, with Jade documenting the boot's performance across various ice conditions, while Pemba managed rope systems and route finding. By 7:15 a.m., they had successfully navigated 12 ladder crossings and reached 18,900 feet elevation when Jade paused to film a detailed segment about crampon penetration in hard ice. Video footage later recovered showed repeated close-up shots of the sole interface under load. He positioned himself on a seemingly stable platform above a narrow crevasse, describing the boot's grip characteristics while demonstrating aggressive footwork techniques. Pemba remained anchored 15 feet away, managing the safety rope that connected them. The failure occurred without warning as Jade shifted his weight during a pivot maneuver designed to showcase the crampon's lateral stability. The carbon fiber integration system fractured along its mounting interface, separating the crampon completely from the left boot sole. Post-incident analysis identified stress concentration along the bonding seam, exacerbated by cold-induced material brittleness. The sudden loss of purchase caused Jade to fall backward toward the crevasse edge, his arms windmilling frantically, while his right crampon caught momentarily on ice before also failing. Pemba lunged forward, but the safety rope went taut too late to arrest David's fall. The dynamic load exceeded the anchor's holding position rather than its rated strength. Jade plummeted 180 feet into the crevasse, his body bouncing twice against the narrow ice walls before wedging between converging surfaces 40 feet from the bottom. Pemba's immediate radio calls brought rescue teams within 3 hours, but technical difficulties accessing the cramped crevasse delayed body recovery for an additional 6 hours. Rescuers found David's phone still clutched in his right hand, displaying a partially completed video review documenting the boot's prototype crampon system, recorded minutes before the failure. The coroner determined death resulted from massive internal trauma, including ruptured organs and multiple bone fractures, consistent with high-impact collision against ice. The prototype gear company recalled all boots and ceased operations. Independent engineers later concluded the design had not undergone sufficient cyclic load testing under sub-zero conditions. It was May 23, 2015. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. The Hillary Step at 28,839 feet marked one of the final technical obstacles before the summit, where climbers queued on fixed ropes during busy weather windows. Heather Brooke was 33 years old, an accountant from San Francisco, California. She had planned this expedition as the culmination of years of training and saving. Her climbing fitness was good, and she had completed several high-altitude climbs on other mountains. She believed she could move efficiently through the summit push and handle the challenges of the death zone. Everest's summit push required climbers to navigate through the death zone above 26,000 feet, where the human body could not survive for extended periods. The Hillary Step was a near-vertical rock face requiring climbers to ascend and descend using fixed ropes. Traffic jams at the step were common during peak season, causing dangerous delays. Climbers waiting in the death zone depleted oxygen supplies and energy reserves. Frostbite, exhaustion, and oxygen deprivation could occur rapidly during delays. The expedition leader briefed the team at Camp 4 before the summit push. He explained that if traffic was heavy at the Hillary Step, they might need to turn around to avoid dangerous delays. Heather listened but made a comment about not turning back after coming this far. Another climber mentioned that waiting in line at altitude could be fatal. Heather cut him off, saying she had been planning this for years and that she could handle the wait. She added that this was her only chance and she wasn't wasting it. The team left Camp 4 after midnight. Heather climbed steadily through the darkness, using supplemental oxygen and following the fixed ropes. Progress was slow in the extreme altitude. By mid-morning, they reached the Hillary Step. A long line of climbers from multiple expeditions was queued on the ropes. The guide estimated a significant wait. The guide gathered the team and recommended they turn around due to the delay. Heather refused. She said she had come too far to turn back now. The guide explained that waiting would deplete their oxygen and energy, making the descent dangerous. Heather argued that she had enough oxygen and could manage. Other team members agreed to descend, but Heather insisted on staying. The guide reluctantly agreed to wait with her, but emphasized they would need to move quickly once through. Heather waited in line at the Hillary Step for an extended period. The temperature was well below zero. She stood clipped to the fixed rope, barely moving. Her oxygen supply was depleting steadily. Her extremities were becoming numb despite insulated gear. Finally, she reached the base of the step and began ascending the near vertical section. She summited after the extended delay. She spent several minutes on top, taking photos despite the guides urging to descend immediately. By the time they began descending, her oxygen supply was running low. She changed to her reserve cylinder. The descent back to the Hillary Step took longer than expected. Heather's movements had slowed noticeably. When they reached the step, another queue had formed for the descent. Climbers were backed up, waiting to descend the fixed ropes. The guide's concern was evident. Heather's oxygen ran out while waiting. She began using the guide's emergency supply. Her coordination deteriorated rapidly without adequate oxygen. When her turn came to descend the step, her movements were clumsy and slow. Partway down the vertical section, she lost her footing. Her weight came onto the fixed rope and safety system. She hung suspended, unable to regain her footing on the near vertical surface. The guide above tried to assist but couldn't reach her position safely. Other climbers helped lower her the rest of the way down the step. She was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. The guide and other climbers attempted to move her downward, but she could no longer coordinate her movements. She collapsed on the route below the Hillary Step. Despite efforts to revive her and administer oxygen from other climbers' supplies, she did not regain consciousness. She died on the route in the death zone. Her body remained on the mountain. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe hypoxia and exhaustion in the death zone. The extended delay at the Hillary Step had depleted her oxygen supply and energy reserves. The lack of supplemental oxygen at extreme altitude had caused rapid deterioration of brain and organ function. Contributing factors included the decision to wait in the queue, despite warnings and extended time in the death zone without adequate oxygen. The death was ruled accidental. It was May 15, 2014. The summit window on Mount Everest had opened. At Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, climbers prepared for summit pushes. Among them was a woman whose confidence would prove catastrophically misplaced. Darcy Sutherland was 41 from Boulder, Colorado. She'd climbed all 58 of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks and completed mountaineering courses. By Colorado standards, she was experienced. However, Colorado's highest peak tops, out at 14,440 feet, where air contains 60% of sea level oxygen. Everest's summit has only 33%. She'd chosen a cheaper expedition company, reasoning she didn't need hand-holding. She'd been vocal during the trek, telling others that most Everest clients were tourists with no business on a serious mountain. Most significantly, Darcy decided she would not use supplemental oxygen, considering this the only legitimate way to summit. Her guide strongly advised against it, explaining fewer than 200 people had summited without oxygen, all elite mountaineers. Darcy dismissed this. During acclimatization, Darcy's confidence seemed justified. She moved quickly, often outpacing others. Her oxygen saturation stayed in the low 70s at Camp 2. She unclipped from fixed ropes on sections she deemed easy. Her guide repeatedly told her to stay clipped in. Darcy argued she'd been climbing 15 years. On May 15th, Darcy's team moved to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet. Her oxygen saturation was 68%, good, especially without supplemental oxygen. That evening, the guide emphasized everyone would use oxygen from Camp 4 onward, non-negotiable. After 30 minutes of argument, Darcy reluctantly agreed to carry oxygen, but made clear she intended to summit without it if possible. The team moved to Camp 4 on May 17th. Darcy struggled more than expected, arriving noticeably fatigued. Her oxygen saturation was 62%. The summit push began at 9 p.m. Darcy started with oxygen at 2 liters per minute. At 27,000 feet, she removed her mask. The guide told her to put it back on. Darcy ignored him. Her pace slowed noticeably. Her movements became less coordinated. At the balcony at 27,500 feet, the guide checked her equipment. She turned off the flow valve. He turned it back on and stated if she turned it off again, he would end her summit attempt immediately. At 28,000 feet as dawn broke, Darcy's coordination became impaired. She stumbled on flat ground. The guide recognized cerebral hypoxia and increased her oxygen flow. They reached the south summit at 28,700 feet around 6:30 a.m. Darcy sat heavily. Her response was slow, words slurred. The guide performed a coordination test. Darcy missed his finger twice. Clear signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE. The guide told Darcy they needed to descend immediately. Darcy refused. The guide radioed base camp. They advised immediate descent. Darcy stood and walked toward the summit, not down. The guide grabbed her arm. Darcy pulled away. At 28,700 feet, he barely had strength to move himself, let alone restrain a client. He followed, hoping to convince her to turn around. Darcy continued at extremely slow pace. Other climbers passed. Several asked if everything was okay. The guide said his client showed cerebral edema signs but refused to descend. At 7:30 a.m., Darcy reached the traverse below the Hillary Step. Her movements were uncoordinated. Halfway across, she stopped, swaying. The guide grabbed her harness. Her eyes were unfocused. She didn't seem to recognize him. The guide turned her around and clipped her, facing downward. Darcy didn't respond but moved when pushed. After approximately 100 feet, her legs buckled. She couldn't support her weight. Her consciousness was declining rapidly. The guide radioed for emergency assistance. He tried dragging her, but moving an incapacitated person at that altitude was nearly impossible. Over 30 minutes, Darcy deteriorated. She became unresponsive. Her breathing became irregular. At 8:15 a.m., she lost consciousness. The guide checked for a pulse, weak and rapid. He tried dragging her toward the south summit, but managed only 50 feet over 20 minutes, exhausting himself to the point of risking his own life. At 8:45 a.m., Darcy stopped breathing. Rescue breathing at 28,600 feet was ineffective. He checked for a pulse. None. Darcy Sutherland was dead. The guide radioed that his client had died. He was instructed to descend immediately. He moved her body slightly off the main route and descended. Days later, a team attempted to move her body but found it frozen in place. Official cause of death was high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors of inadequate supplemental oxygen use, continued ascent despite symptoms, and refusal to descend when advised. The guide's radio logs documented his repeated warnings and Darcy's refusals. Darcy Sutherland's body remains on Everest at approximately 28,550 feet, visible to climbers who pass that section. It was April 28, 2015. The Khumbu Valley was still unsettled. 3 days earlier, the Gorkha earthquake had torn through Nepal and sent shockwaves up the mountain that scattered teams, collapsed sections of the icefall, and killed climbers at base camp. But higher on the mountain, above the immediate chaos, a narrow weather window had cracked open. A handful of teams were still moving, and one climber in particular was moving fast. Not because of the window, but because of someone else. Zoran Ashby was the kind of guy who turned everything into a competition. 27 years old, fitness creator, built his whole channel around one idea, that most people are just soft. No excuses, no rest days, no slow and steady. He had learned sometime before the summit push that another creator he had publicly positioned himself against was on the mountain with a separate expedition and was ahead of him in acclimatization rotations. So Zoran pushed for the summit after completing only one rotation to Camp 2 instead of the standard 2. His expedition leader flagged it. Zoran said he felt fine. He had summited peaks up to 6,400 meters before, never anything close to Everest, and I think he genuinely believed his fitness would cover the gap. That's the thing about the mountain. It doesn't care how strong you are. Here's something most people don't think about when it comes to high altitude climbing. Acclimatization isn't optional, it's biological. Your body needs time to adjust to the drop in oxygen pressure, and there's no shortcut for that process, regardless of fitness level. Skip the rotations and you're essentially rolling the dice on whether your body can cope with what's coming. The symptoms of a body that can't cope start subtle. A cough, some breathlessness, fatigue, easy to dismiss, easy to push through if pushing through is your whole identity. The problem is that above 23,000 feet, subtle doesn't stay subtle for long. At Camp 3, 24,500 feet, Zoran developed a persistent cough he told his Sherpa was just the dry air. His expedition doctor at base camp picked up on something during a radio check and recommended he descend for observation. Zoran declined. He cited his rival's position on the mountain. That night he slept badly, and by morning his lips had taken on a faint bluish tint his Sherpa recognized immediately. Reminds me of other cases I've covered where everyone around the victim saw it, coming before the victim did. And still, he packed up and pushed toward Camp 4. At what point do you stop calling it confidence and start calling it something else? He didn't make it far. Within 2 hours of leaving Camp 3, he had fallen well behind the group. The Sherpa behind him noted his pace had become slow and irregular. His breathing had changed too. The Sherpa could hear it, a wet crackling sound with each exhale, the kind that doesn't come from dry air or exertion. At around 25,800 feet, he stopped moving and sat down on his pack. His Sherpa reached him within minutes. Zoran was conscious but confused. Couldn't answer what day it was. Couldn't track a simple question. His oxygen saturation read 48% on the Sherpa's pulse oximeter. To put that in context, a healthy person at sea level sits around 95 to 99%. Even accounting for altitude, 48% is critical. Fluid had filled a significant portion of both lungs. He could not stand without help. 2 Sherpas began a new, immediate descent with him, supported between them. He lost consciousness before they had covered much ground. CPR was performed on the slope for 14 minutes. He didn't respond. 14 minutes on a near vertical slope at 25,000 feet. I want you to think about what that actually looks like. Base camp was notified and a helicopter evacuation was requested, but weather conditions in the valley, still unstable in the days following the earthquake, made a high-altitude extraction impossible that morning. The team held position for 2 hours before confirming he had no pulse. His body was evacuated by helicopter 2 days later when conditions finally allowed it. I've covered deaths that were sudden and deaths that were slow. This one sits somewhere uncomfortable in between because there was a clear window where he could have turned around and chose not to. The postmortem confirmed bilateral pulmonary edema as cause of death. Both lungs had accumulated fluid, consistent with rapid ascent without adequate acclimatization. His camera was recovered at Camp 3. The last thing on it was a clip filmed the morning of his final push, him visibly struggling to finish sentences, breathless between every few words. The expedition's radio logs confirmed the descent recommendation had been issued and declined roughly 18 hours before he died. The case was ruled accidental, with self-directed deviation from the acclimatization protocol listed as the primary contributing factor. Zoran had spent years telling his audience that the body could handle anything if the mind was strong enough. Everest answered that one for him. It was May 19th, 2016, on the South Col Road of Mount Everest, at the Geneva Spur Traverse, around 26,800 feet. The morning was clear but bitterly cold, and the fixed line cut across a slope of blue ice exposed to constant wind. Climbers were stalled by traffic, standing still in an environment where standing still steadily drains the body. Nothing failed all at once. The danger accumulated quietly during the wait. Thomas Ilić was 41, a Serbian civil engineer who spent weekdays managing infrastructure projects and weekends training for endurance events. He approached Everest the same way he approached work, with spreadsheets, schedules, and contingency tables. Teammates respected his discipline, but noticed his fixation on timing. He believed delays were the most dangerous variable on the mountain, something to be minimized at all costs. Ravi Patel was 34, an Indian logistics coordinator on his first 8,000-meter peak. He was fit at lower altitudes, but had limited experience above 7,000 meters. Ravi was optimistic to a fault, trusting that effort and positive thinking could compensate for acclimatization gaps. He carried standard supplemental oxygen and followed a commercial plan, but his preparation at extreme altitude was thin. The traverse backed up as climbers ahead struggled to move efficiently. Ravi arrived late to the line, visibly hypoxic, his movements sloppy and speech slurred. He fumbled with his carabiner and leaned heavily on the rope. Thomas noticed the delay, pushing his schedule past the planned turnaround window. Wind chill dropped temperatures near minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing moisture instantly. Ravi stopped completely, breathing hard, unable to coordinate clipping and unclipping. Thomas weighed the choice quickly. Leaving Ravi there meant further delay and risk to everyone behind. He removed his own regulator and handed it over, intending to help Ravi recover for a minute and keep the line moving. Thomas remained clipped but was now breathing ambient air in the death zone. As Ravi increased his oxygen flow, moisture inside the regulator condensed and froze. The valve iced internally, sealing shut. Oxygen delivery stopped without warning. Ravi's breathing grew frantic as he tugged at the hose, unable to understand why nothing was coming through. Thomas inhaled deeply, expecting relief that never arrived. Thomas dropped to one knee, then tipped sideways onto the icy traverse. His helmet struck the slope, and he lay still, his body starved of oxygen. Ravi, panicking and nearly blind from hypoxia, stepped over him. His boots skidded on polished ice. The Jamar on his line failed to reseat as he loaded it unevenly. Ravi slid, accelerated, struck the slope once, and vanished over the edge below the fixed line. Moments later, Thomas attempted to recover, reaching weakly for the rope. His tether failed to hold on the icy sheath. He was pulled from the traverse and fell after Ravi, out of sight. Climbers above called the incident immediately over the radio. No rescue was possible at that altitude and location. Both men fell hundreds of feet. Recovery was delayed by the weather and traffic. The post-mortem examination concluded that both deaths began with acute hypoxia, followed by massive blunt force trauma. Ravi's regulator was recovered later, the valve frozen shut with zero airflow. Thomas showed no evidence of supplemental oxygen use at the time of his fall. Thomas's planning documents circulated quietly among teammates afterward as an example of schedule pressure overriding judgment. Ravi's family received the recovered regulator months later, and the internal ice was still locking the valve in place. It was May 8, 2017, at Camp 3 on Mount Everest's North Ridge, elevation 25,600 feet. The early morning was cold and windy, with climbers checking tents and equipment, while others moved cautiously across the ice and rock. Nora Kessler, 28, had organized a personal climbing project to attempt the Everest summit, hiring Ong Chiring Sherpa and his team for $45,000 to provide guidance and support. She insisted on completing sections of the climb independently, often refusing advice from the Sherpas about weather conditions, route selection, and safety protocols in order to test her personal limits. Her pack sat next to the tent, straps loosely coiled. High-altitude mountaineering above 25,000 feet requires constant support systems, including shared body heat and coordinated decision-making about weather windows and evacuation procedures. Standard expedition practice involves climbers remaining within visual or radio contact, especially during summit pushes, due to the rapid onset of medical emergencies at altitude. Climbers typically travel in groups with redundant safety equipment, communication devices, and predetermined emergency protocols. The death zone environment creates rapid physiological deterioration, including impaired judgment, hypothermia, and altitude sickness that can prove fatal within hours without proper support. Medical literature, cited in the post-incident review, emphasized that cognitive impairment at this elevation often prevents accurate self-assessment of risk. Kessler had refused additional support, carrying only basic supplies and declining supplemental safety equipment recommended by her guides. A thin layer of frost covered the surface of the platform. The confrontation began when Ong Chiring advised immediate descent due to approaching storm systems that weather services had predicted would bring sustained winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and temperatures dropping below minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Satellite forecasts available to expedition leaders indicated a narrowing weather window, with instability increasing earlier than initially projected. Kessler accused the team of sabotaging her summit attempt and demanded they continue climbing, despite conditions that experienced mountaineers recognized as potentially fatal. When the Sherpas refused to proceed, citing safety protocols and their responsibility to other clients, Kessler threatened to withhold payment and post negative reviews that would damage their guiding reputation. She ordered them to leave her equipment and descend immediately. Ong Chering attempted to convince Kessler to descend with them, but she remained on site. After 40 minutes of discussion, the Sherpas departed at 2:30 p.m., leaving Kessler alone with 4 days of food, limited fuel, and basic communication equipment. Her camera recorded 6 days of activity, showing signs consistent with hypothermia, dehydration, and altitude sickness. The storm arrived 6 hours earlier than forecasted, trapping Kessler in her tent with winds reaching 75 miles per hour. Her phone recorded 6 days of activity, showing impaired coordination, slurred speech, and decreased responsiveness. The final entry occurred shortly before she lost consciousness. Rescue teams reached her location on May 14th after the weather cleared. Access was delayed due to avalanche risk and unstable ice conditions along the fixed lines. The coroner determined death resulted from severe hypothermia, dehydration, and hypoxic brain injury caused by prolonged exposure to extreme altitude and weather conditions. The tent partially collapsed from the force of the wind. Ong Chering faced no legal consequences as investigators determined the Sherpas had followed established safety protocols by refusing to continue in dangerous conditions. The incident prompted new regulations requiring expedition leaders to maintain communication with abandoned clients and report emergencies to rescue authorities regardless of client preferences. Policy would change, but it could not rewrite the events of those 6 days. Equipment left behind sat undisturbed on the ridge. Even as higher up, another climber balanced on a narrow ledge, filming their ascent in the thin Himalayan air. It was February 11th, 2018. The steep alpine couloirs above a Colorado backcountry area had been closed due to extreme avalanche danger following 3 consecutive days of heavy snowfall that deposited over 30 inches of unstable powder. Finn Okafor was 26, a ski instructor from Michigan with moderate mountaineering experience, including several alpine couloir climbs in the Rockies and Cascades. He'd taken an avalanche awareness course 2 years prior and had summited several 14,000-foot peaks via snow climbs. Finn was visiting Colorado and wanted to climb a route called Dragon's Tail, a steep snow and ice couloir approximately 800 feet tall with an average angle of 50 degrees. He planned to ascend using crampons and ice axes. Finn carried an avalanche beacon, probe, and shovel, proper safety gear, but was climbing alone, meaning rescue would be impossible even with a beacon signal. Steep couloirs are natural avalanche funnels. When a slab releases above a climber in a narrow gully, there is no escape. The debris has nowhere to go except straight down the fall line, concentrating into a deep, fast-moving mass. Climbers caught in couloir avalanches are often buried under significantly more snow than those caught on open slopes, and the narrow confines make rescue extremely difficult. A solo climber caught in a couloir avalanche has virtually no survival chance, even with proper safety equipment, because there is no one to conduct a rescue. Finn reached the base of Dragon's Tail around noon, where signs clearly marked the closure and detailed the high avalanche danger. He assessed the couloir visually from below and saw no obvious signs of recent avalanche activity. He did not perform a snow pit test or observe for red flags like shooting cracks or whumping sounds. He began climbing around 12:30 p.m. The first 200 feet went smoothly. The snow was deep, but consolidated enough to accept his crampon placements. He moved steadily upward, placing his ice axes rhythmically and kicking steps into the slope. The couloir walls rose steeply on either side, funneling his route into an increasingly narrow channel. At approximately 350 feet, Finn paused to rest. The angle had steepened noticeably, requiring more deliberate movements. He could see the couloir narrowing further ahead before opening near the summit ridge. He continued climbing. Around 450 feet up, Finn placed his ice axe into the snow for his next move. The impact sent a small shock wave through the snowpack. He felt a subtle settlement beneath his feet. Then he heard it, a deep whoomph, as a weak layer collapsed somewhere in the snowpack above him. A fracture line cracked across the couloir, approximately 150 feet above his position. The slab, compressed into the narrow channel, released all at once. Roughly 80 feet wide and 2 feet deep, the avalanche funneled directly down the couloir toward Finn at accelerating speed. He had perhaps 3 seconds of warning. He attempted to move laterally toward the rock wall, but was immediately engulfed. The force knocked him off his feet and ripped his ice axes from his hands. He tumbled violently, completely disoriented, as the avalanche carried him downward. Snow packed into his mouth and nose. His body slammed into the couloir walls repeatedly. The avalanche carried him approximately 400 feet before the debris began slowing near the base of the couloir. Finn came to rest buried under roughly 5 feet of compacted snow. He was positioned on his side with his arms pinned tightly against his body. No air pocket formed. The weight of the snow compressed his chest completely, making breathing impossible. He couldn't move any part of his body. Consciousness faded within minutes as oxygen deprivation took hold. His heart stopped shortly after. No one witnessed the avalanche. Finn's absence wasn't reported until early evening when he failed to return to his lodging. His car was found at the trailhead the following morning. A search team deployed that afternoon detected his beacon signal at the base of Dragon's Tail and located his body after 20 minutes of probing Berdui, buried under 5 feet of debris. The beacon was still transmitting when they found him, and all his safety gear was present and functional. But it hadn't mattered. His body showed fractured ribs, a broken left arm, severe contusions, and a concussion. But the cause of death was compressive asphyxia. Analysis of the debris revealed a classic weak layer structure. Recent heavy snowfall loaded onto a faceted layer formed during a cold, clear period the previous week. His climbing track was visible in the remaining snow leading up to the fracture point. The death was ruled accidental by asphyxiation from avalanche burial. Investigators noted that Finn had ignored closure signs and climbed alone into terrain where even proper safety equipment couldn't have saved him. Solo climbing in avalanche terrain eliminates the only realistic chance of survival: immediate companion rescue. It was May 19th, 2016. Weather conditions on Mount Everest were deteriorating after a brief summit window had closed the previous day. Other teams were still high on the mountain, racing against worsening conditions. Felicity Whitmore was 46 from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she ran an event planning company built on rigid schedules. Before leaving for Nepal, she created a comprehensive spreadsheet detailing every day of the expedition, specific time blocks for each activity, exact dates for each camp, the precise day she would summit. The guide explained that Everest doesn't follow schedules. Weather and conditions dictate timing. Felicity responded that proper planning prevents problems. The expedition deviated from her schedule almost immediately. Weather delays put them 2 days behind. Felicity became visibly stressed. During acclimatization, her inflexibility created constant friction. When the guide recommended extra rest due to high winds, Felicity refused, stating rest was scheduled for the following day. By mid-May, her schedule had become disconnected from reality. On May 17th, Felicity's team moved to Camp 3. The plan was to move to Camp 4 on May 18th, then attempt the summit that night. At Camp 3, the guide emphasized a turnaround time of 1 p.m. on May 19th, regardless of position. Felicity argued that 1 p.m. was too early. The guide stated firmly that clients who didn't agree would not be permitted to attempt the summit. The team moved to Camp 4 on May 18th. Felicity arrived at 3 p.m., exhausted. Oxygen saturation 61%. The guide told her to rest before the summit push at 10 p.m. Felicity spent the rest period checking gear and reviewing her timeline. She barely rested. The summit push began at 10 p.m. Conditions were marginal. Higher winds than forecasted. Temperature minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Felicity climbed aggressively, pushing past other climbers. The guide repeatedly told her to maintain steady pace. Felicity ignored him. By midnight, she was ahead of her group. At 1 a.m., her pace began to slow. They reached the balcony at 27,500 feet around 4 a.m. Behind her calculated pace, she became visibly agitated. The climb to the south summit was brutal. Winds increased to 40 to 50 miles per hour. Wind chill approaching minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time they reached the south summit at 28,700 feet, around 7:30 a.m., she was completely exhausted. She collapsed in the snow, unable to stand. The guide assessed her condition, coherent but extremely fatigued, oxygen saturation 56%, movement slow and uncoordinated. He decided they would not continue. They would descend. Felicity refused. The guide explained she was exhausted, weather was deteriorating, and they needed to descend. Felicity checked her watch. Only 7:30 a.m. They had until 1 p.m. The guide explained the turnaround time was for being back at this position and descending, not for reaching the summit. The guide stated firmly they were descending. Felicity refused to move. After 10 minutes, the guide told her he was descending with or without her. Felicity stated she was continuing. The guide radioed base camp. They advised him to descend. He made one final attempt. She refused. He began descending around 7:50 a.m. Felicity rested 20 minutes, then climbed toward the summit at extremely slow pace. At 9:30 a.m., she reached the Hillary Step, taking 45 minutes to ascend it. The final 200 feet took another 45 minutes. She reached the summit around 11 a.m., alone. She sat down, too exhausted to stand, and remained 15 minutes before descending. The descent was catastrophic. By the time she descended the Hillary Step around 12:30 p.m., she'd been moving for 13 and a half hours. Her pace slowed to 50 feet every 10 minutes. At 1 p.m., the turnaround time, she was still at 28,600 feet. She sat down, unable to continue. She tried to radio but couldn't operate it. Cognitive function severely impaired. At 1:30 p.m., weather deteriorated sharply. Wind increased to 60+ miles per hour. Visibility dropped. Snow fell. At 2 p.m., climbers found Felicity sitting unresponsive. She was conscious but severely hypothermic and unable to move. They radioed base camp. Base camp told them to do what they could, then descend. The climbers gave her an oxygen bottle at maximum flow and tried setting up shelter, but wind was too strong. After 30 minutes, they descended at 2:45 p.m. No one else passed her position. At some point during the afternoon or evening, Felicity Whitmore died from hypothermia, exhaustion, and hypoxia. Her body was found May 21st, frozen solid, where the climbers had left her. The oxygen bottle was empty. Official cause of death was exposure and hypothermia with contributing factors of exhaustion and hypoxia. The investigation noted she'd summited more than 3 hours after her guide recommended turning back and been caught by forecasted deteriorating weather. It was May 21st, 2015, on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest, just below the Hillary Step. The morning was cold and clear, with steady wind and a slow line of climbers edging upward. Radios crackled intermittently, but otherwise the ridge was quiet. The route looked stable, yet it relied on constant tension, attention, and shared awareness to remain safe. Lucas Benitez was 29, an Argentine audio technician who spent his career managing live sound for touring bands. He was known for staying calm when equipment failed and crowds pressed in. Training runs and long climbs were always done with music, a habit he believed kept his breathing even and his mind steady. His expedition was modest and self-funded, with no sponsors, only encouragement from co-workers who followed his progress online. Lucas understood technical systems. He respected gear and processes, but he trusted routine deeply. On Everest, the southeast ridge is a narrow spine of snow and rock protected by fixed lines. Movement depends on climbers staying clipped, spacing themselves, and responding instantly to changes ahead. At extreme altitude, delays in reaction can be fatal, even when conditions appear controlled. Summit traffic was heavy that morning. Above Camp 4, guides had warned teams to expect congestion near the Hillary Step. Lucas chose to keep his earbuds in, music low but constant, believing it helped regulate his pace. He ignored the suggestion to remove them in crowded sections. He stayed clipped in and advanced when the line moved. Several climbers ahead were negotiating a short rock step. One slipped briefly, unloading the rope before regaining footing. Shouts went up as a warning, but the wind carried sound unevenly. Lucas did not hear them. The fixed line slackened suddenly, then shifted. Seeing movement ahead, Lucas stepped forward. His weight transferred as the rope dropped away from tension. His front boot met empty air where the line had been supporting balance. He pitched forward instantly, momentum carrying him headfirst down the slope. His helmet struck a rock lip, forcing his neck backward beyond its limit. The cervical spine failed at the upper vertebrae. His body continued to tumble, striking snow and stone before sliding to a stop several meters below the line. The fall was violent but brief. Climbers above froze, then radioed for help. One guide descended carefully within minutes, reaching Lucas and attempting an assessment. There was no response, no voluntary movement, and no breathing pattern consistent with life. Earbuds were still seated, music audible in the thin air. Rescue teams were notified immediately, but response at that altitude was limited. It took approximately 40 minutes for additional climbers to secure the area and reach him safely. By then, it was clear there was nothing to be done. Lucas was secured to the line to prevent further sliding. The medical assessment later described a high cervical spine fracture with complete spinal cord transection. The injury would have caused instant paralysis and loss of breathing. Death occurred within seconds of impact. There were no signs of prolonged suffering. No equipment failure was found. The rope, anchors, and carabiners were intact. The incident resulted from a momentary loss of situational awareness during congestion. After the expedition, Lucas's employer posted a short memorial urging climbers to remove headphones above Camp 4. The message was shared widely among mountaineers. It traveled faster than any official advisory. Authorities recorded the death as accidental and closed the route temporarily. Team leaders reviewed communication protocols and spacing rules. No citations were issued. The mountain returned to routine traffic within days after standard internal safety reviews. It was April 14, 2015. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Base camp sat at 17,600 feet, where climbers registered with expedition companies and liaison officers before attempting the summit. Denise Carmichael was 42 years old, an insurance claims adjuster from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her experience consisted of 2 guided day hikes in Sedona and 1 summit of a 10,000-foot peak in Colorado. She had paid for a budget expedition package, but believed the mandatory liaison officer registration was unnecessary bureaucracy designed to generate revenue rather than ensure safety. Everest's routes above base camp required specialized high-altitude equipment and acclimatization. The Khumbu icefall between base camp and Camp 1 was a maze of shifting ice blocks and hidden crevasses. Weather patterns shifted rapidly at extreme altitude, with temperatures well below freezing even during climbing season. Supplemental oxygen became critical above 26,000 feet. Climbers followed fixed rope routes established by climbing teams. A registration tent at base camp processed climbing permits and route assignments. Denise approached the checkpoint and asked about the route. The liaison officer explained the permit system and the requirement to register her climb with her expedition group. She argued that permits were revenue generation schemes. The officer explained that permits helped coordinate rescues and track climber locations on the mountain. Denise's voice grew louder as she insisted she had prepared thoroughly. She stated that she had paid thousands of dollars for the expedition and had a right to climb independently. Other climbers waiting in line watched the exchange. The officer repeated that climbing without proper registration violated regulations and created safety risks. Denise remained at the checkpoint, arms crossed, insisting the policy was unreasonable. After several more minutes of back and forth, she finally turned away and walked toward the tent area. The next morning, she left base camp before dawn without her assigned group. She carried a day pack that appeared too light for a proper attempt through the icefall. Another climber noticed her heading toward the Khumbu icefall alone. She moved quickly, staying away from the main route where teams were working. She followed a less traveled path through the icefall that experienced climbers avoided due to instability. Denise navigated through the ice formations for some time, gaining elevation. The route narrowed as it approached a section where ice blocks towered overhead. She had minimal equipment and no partner for safety. She began crossing a snow bridge over a crevasse. Her right foot broke through the thin snow layer. She lost balance and fell through the surface. She dropped into the crevasse, falling before wedging between ice walls and a narrow shaft. The fall had caused injuries, including a fractured leg and severe bruising to her torso. She tried to climb out, but couldn't manage the smooth ice walls with her injuries. The crevasse was only a few feet wide at her position, with no way to maneuver. She pulled out her phone, but had no signal. She had limited water and some food. No rope, no ice axe, no emergency beacon beyond her phone. The temperature inside the crevasse was well below freezing. She remained wedged in that position. Hours passed. The limited daylight that reached the crevasse faded. Temperature dropped further as darkness came. By the second day, she was shivering uncontrollably. Her movements were slow and uncoordinated from the cold and altitude. She attempted to shift position, but managed only slight movements. The extreme cold continued. She had been without adequate water. Her body was shutting down from hypothermia, shock from the injuries, dehydration, and altitude effects at nearly 19,000 feet. She lost consciousness sometime on the third day. A team working on the fixed ropes spotted the collapsed snow bridge. They investigated and found her in the crevasse. A rescue team reached her location. She had no pulse and was not breathing. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe hypothermia, dehydration, shock from untreated injuries, and altitude-related complications. The fractures had caused blood loss and compromised the body's ability to regulate temperature in the extreme cold. Dehydration and the thin air at that elevation had accelerated the decline. The lack of emergency equipment, adequate supplies, and communication devices meant she had no way to signal for help. The death was ruled accidental. Her expedition company reported her missing when she failed to return to base camp.